It was a typical Tuesday morning at University of Ashford, and the lecture hall was packed. The hum of students chatting, the rustle of notebooks being opened, and the faint scent of coffee in the air all seemed to blur into the background as Marcus Johnson entered the room. As a sophomore, Marcus had become accustomed to the feeling of being the only black student in many of his classes. But today was different. Today, his professor, Dr. Thomas, had something in store for him that he wasn't prepared for. Professor Thomas, a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, calculating gaze, was known for his intelligence and no-nonsense attitude. His lectures were intense, and he had an uncanny way of making students feel both uncomfortable and intrigued. But he also had a reputation, one that some students whispered about, especially when it came to his treatment of black students. Marcus had heard the rumors but always brushed them aside. After all, he was here to succeed, no matter what. As Marcus walked into the room, his gaze naturally went to the front, where Dr. Thomas was standing, fiddling with his notes. The moment their eyes met, the professor's lips curled into a tight smile. It was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus had seen it before, and it always sent a chill down his spine. "Ah, Marcus." Dr. Thomas's voice echoed through the lecture hall, causing the entire class to turn toward him. "I'm glad you're here today. I've been waiting for you to answer a very important question." Marcus' stomach tightened. He had always tried to fly under the radar in this class, but now, it seemed, he was being dragged into the spotlight. "Sure, Professor," Marcus said, forcing a smile, his palms beginning to sweat. Dr. Thomas walked toward the center of the room, and the class fell into an almost eerie silence. "Tell us, Marcus," the professor said, a trace of sarcasm in his tone, "do you really think you have what it takes to pass my class? I mean, based on your last paper, it left much to be desired." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Marcus could feel the heat rising to his face. His last paper had been a challenge, but he had worked hard on it, and he had expected at least some constructive feedback. Instead, Dr. Thomas's words felt like a direct attack on his abilities and, by extension, his worth. The entire class was watching, waiting to see what Marcus would say. For a moment, Marcus considered staying silent, hoping the awkwardness would dissipate. But then he remembered something his mom had always told him: the world won't give you respect if you don't demand it for yourself. So, he straightened his shoulders, looked Dr. Thomas squarely in the eye, and responded calmly, "I think I do have what it takes, Professor. I'm not here to take up space, I'm here to learn." A few students exchanged glances, and Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes. He could feel the pressure building, both from his classmates and from the professor himself. Dr. Thomas's smile faltered for a moment, but then he recovered, his gaze turning cold. "We'll see about that," he said, his voice laced with an edge. "Now, let's move on to the next topic. Perhaps you can redeem yourself with a little bit of class participation." The class reluctantly moved on, but Marcus felt the sting of the professor's words long after the conversation had shifted. As the lecture continued, he couldn't help but replay the moment in his mind. Why had Dr. Thomas singled him out like that? It wasn't the first time he'd made an offhand comment about Marcus's performance, but it was the first time it had felt so personal. The rest of the class passed in a blur, and Marcus struggled to focus on the lecture. His mind kept drifting back to the professor's question. What did he mean by, "Do you really think you have what it takes?" Was this just a test? A power move? Or was there something deeper to it, something racial, perhaps? Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He was tired of this, tired of being made to feel like he wasn't good enough, that he was always being judged based on the color of his skin. But he had learned the hard way not to make waves. He had to stay focused, get his degree, and make something of himself. That was all that mattered. But today was different. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't going to let Dr. Thomas, or anyone else, question his worth. Not anymore. As the bell rang and the class filed out of the room, Marcus lingered for a moment, taking deep breaths. The weight of the interaction still sat heavy on his shoulders. But he wasn't alone. A few students, including Jenna, a friend from his sociology class, gave him encouraging nods as they passed by. Jenna, a fiery activist with a sharp mind, had always been supportive of Marcus, even when the rest of the class seemed indifferent. She knew what it was like to feel marginalized on campus. "Don't let him get to you, Marcus," she said softly as she passed him. "He's an old-school dinosaur. We all know how he is." Marcus offered her a small smile, grateful for the support. "Thanks, Jenna." But as the students trickled out and the room emptied, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Something inside him was stirring, something that was ready to fight back. He didn't know how or when, but he knew that his moment was coming. The next time Dr. Thomas tried to humiliate him, he wouldn't be quiet. He wouldn't just take it. And he would make sure that everyone in that room knew it. As Marcus walked out of the lecture hall, he couldn't help but think about what his mom had always said: "The world won't give you respect if you don't demand it for yourself." He was about to demand it. And it would be a lot harder for anyone to ignore him now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Marcus Johnson was no stranger to struggle. Growing up in a tight-knit, working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Ashford, he had learned early that life didn't hand out anything for free. His mother, an elementary school teacher, and his father, a mechanic, did their best to provide for him and his two younger sisters. But even with all the love and support they offered, Marcus knew the world outside their home wasn't always kind, especially to someone like him. As a kid, Marcus had been determined to prove that he was more than the circumstances he was born into. He was a smart, curious child with a passion for learning that was encouraged by his mother, who would spend hours after dinner reading with him or helping him with his schoolwork. But Marcus was also painfully aware that, as a black kid in a predominantly white neighborhood, he was always different. And while his parents worked hard to shield him from the worst of it, Marcus still encountered racism in small doses that slowly started to add up. In elementary school, Marcus had been the target of racist comments from a few of his classmates. It wasn't anything overt, just offhand comments like, "You're pretty smart for a black kid," or "I didn't know people like you were into math." It didn't take long for Marcus to realize that these seemingly harmless comments were rooted in a deep-seated belief that he didn't belong. These little moments, though fleeting, were like paper cuts, small, but they added up over time. By the time he entered high school, Marcus had become used to the subtle racism around him. He had learned to navigate the world with a combination of sharp intellect and quiet defiance. He was always the top student in his class, pushing himself to be better than everyone else, not just to prove his worth to the world, but also to prove it to himself. But no matter how hard he worked, it always felt like there was an unspoken expectation that he would eventually fall short. Despite the challenges, Marcus excelled in school. He was a star athlete on the track team, a gifted math student, and a passionate advocate for social justice. He was well liked by many of his teachers, and his classmates admired him for his dedication and discipline. But underneath his achievements, Marcus struggled with an internal conflict: the need to prove his worth against the backdrop of systemic inequality. The turning point came during his senior year of high school. Marcus had been working tirelessly on a college application essay, pouring his heart into every word. He wrote about his experiences growing up as a black male in America, about the obstacles he'd faced and the resilience that had carried him through. It was a powerful essay, one that he knew would resonate with any admissions officer who read it. When the acceptance letters arrived, Marcus was ecstatic to see that he had been accepted to the University of Ashford with a full scholarship. But that happiness was tempered by the realization that he was one of only a handful of black students accepted into the prestigious school. He was about to enter a world that, while full of opportunity, was also teeming with challenges he hadn't fully prepared for. The first few weeks on campus had been a whirlwind of new faces, new classes, and new experiences. Marcus was determined to prove himself worthy of his place at the university, but the weight of being one of the few black students in his classes often felt heavy. He would catch the occasional glance, see students whispering in the hallway, or hear quiet mutterings from the back of classrooms. Sometimes, the ignorance wasn't even subtle, it was a question like, "How did you get into this class?" or, "What's it like, being the only one here?" These comments stung, but Marcus had learned how to keep his head down and push through. He threw himself into his studies, hoping that academic excellence would be enough to drown out the doubts others had about him. But the more he pushed himself, the more he realized that his race would always be a part of his identity in the eyes of others. It wasn't something he could escape, and it wasn't something he wanted to ignore. Professor Thomas had been one of the first faculty members to make an impression on Marcus, though not in the way he would have hoped. The professor had a reputation for being a brilliant academic, but Marcus had quickly noticed something else, a subtle but pervasive condescension toward students of color. In his first few weeks in the class, Marcus had received a couple of offhand comments from Dr. Thomas that made him uneasy. One comment stood out in particular. After Marcus had made an insightful point during a lecture about racial inequality in American history, Dr. Thomas had smiled condescendingly and said, "Interesting perspective, Marcus. Not quite what I expected from someone of your background, but it's good to see you're thinking critically." It was a backhanded compliment, one that Marcus couldn't ignore. In that moment, Marcus had felt like he was being judged not for the content of his thoughts, but for the color of his skin. Despite his growing unease, Marcus had tried to stay focused. He was here to learn, not to get bogged down by petty biases. But deep down, he knew that this was something he couldn't just ignore forever. Eventually, he would have to confront it head-on. As the semester wore on, the tension in the classroom grew. Marcus found himself increasingly at odds with Professor Thomas, who would often single him out with challenging questions and subtle jabs. It wasn't just that Dr. Thomas questioned his intelligence, it was that he seemed to do it in a way that made Marcus feel like he had to constantly prove himself. Every time Dr. Thomas made a sarcastic remark, Marcus felt like he was being forced into a corner, forced to defend his place in the classroom, and forced to prove that he deserved to be there. Marcus had heard the whispers from his classmates, some of them were friendly, while others were more judgmental. "He's just trying to stir things up," one student had said about him. "Doesn't he realize how much harder he has to work to be taken seriously?" Another had remarked, "Maybe he should just let it go. Why make waves?" But Marcus couldn't let it go. The more Dr. Thomas pushed him, the more determined he became to stand his ground. He wasn't going to let anyone make him feel small. He had earned his place in that classroom, and he was going to prove it. Now, as Marcus sat in the lecture hall, reflecting on the conversation he had just had with Dr. Thomas, a new sense of resolve began to build within him. He wasn't just going to take the professor's treatment lying down. He was going to speak up, whether it was easy or not. Today had been the moment he had been waiting for. The moment he decided that he would no longer let anyone define his worth. And as he glanced around the room, the faces of his classmates staring at him, Marcus realized that it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been treated as less than. He wasn't just a student anymore. He was a voice that was ready to be heard. It had been a week since the encounter with Dr. Thomas, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. The professor's words, his dismissive tone, had settled deep into his chest. It was as if they had taken root, and now they were growing into something bigger, something that Marcus wasn't sure how to confront. His classmates had mostly gone back to their usual routines, chatting in groups before class, sharing laughs, and doing their best to avoid conflict. But for Marcus, things had changed. He had tried to focus on his work, throwing himself into his studies as he always did, but every time he sat down to study or do his assignments, his mind would wander back to the way Dr. Thomas had singled him out. It was more than just the comment, it was the feeling of being less than. It was the way the professor had questioned his very presence in the class, making Marcus feel like an outsider. Dr. Thomas's subtle digs had been building for a while, and now it felt like a personal battle was brewing. Marcus wasn't the type to confront people easily, but this time it was different. He had worked too hard to get to this point, and he wasn't about to let anyone make him feel small. The thing that gnawed at him the most, though, was the fact that Dr. Thomas's behavior wasn't unique. Marcus had encountered similar attitudes before, those quiet, dismissive actions that made him feel like an exception, rather than an equal. Whether it was a glance, an offhand comment, or an assumption about his abilities, it all added up to the same thing: Marcus was constantly being made to feel like he had to prove his worth just to be seen as capable. But Marcus had a plan. He knew he had to be strategic. He couldn't let Dr. Thomas think he was the type of person who would shrink away in fear. Marcus had faced challenges in his life, he had faced harder things than this. His mother had always taught him that people like Dr. Thomas thrived on seeing others falter, and the best way to deal with them was to stand tall, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. It was during the next lecture that the situation escalated. As Marcus settled into his seat, he could feel Dr. Thomas's eyes on him, almost as if he was waiting for a reaction. The air in the room was thick with anticipation, as if the professor knew something was about to happen, but wasn't sure how to push it. Marcus sat up straighter, his muscles tensed, ready for whatever the professor was going to throw at him. The class began as usual, with Dr. Thomas droning on about a complex theory on economic inequality. But it didn't take long before the professor's sharp gaze landed on Marcus. "Marcus," Dr. Thomas called out, breaking the flow of the lecture. "Perhaps you can explain this theory to the class. I'm curious to hear your perspective on it, if you're able to follow along." The comment came without warning, and a hush fell over the room. Marcus could feel every set of eyes turning toward him, every student now hanging on the edge of their seat, waiting to see how he would respond. For a moment, Marcus's heart raced in his chest. He had already given his thoughts on the subject in a previous class discussion, and he knew the material inside and out. But this wasn't just about economics, it was about Dr. Thomas trying to put him on the spot again, trying to publicly undermine him. The power dynamics were clear, and it felt like an intentional jab. But Marcus wasn't going to let Dr. Thomas win. He had worked too hard, studied too much, and fought against too many odds to let this man, this professor, make him feel inferior. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, and then stood up. "I believe the theory suggests that economic inequality is a direct result of the systemic structures put in place by society to maintain the status quo," Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "It's not just about individual wealth, it's about how resources are distributed and how that shapes access to opportunities, education, healthcare, and even basic survival." As Marcus spoke, he could feel a sense of control washing over him. He wasn't just explaining a theory, he was reclaiming his space in the classroom. He wasn't going to be dismissed or belittled. Every word he said, every point he made, was a declaration of his worth, of his intellect. Dr. Thomas was silent for a moment, his usual smirk replaced by a look of mild surprise. Marcus had nailed it, he had hit the nail on the head. The professor knew it, and the class knew it too. Marcus had answered his question confidently, and without hesitation. But the tension in the room didn't dissolve. Instead, it thickened, because Dr. Thomas wasn't the type to let a challenge go unanswered. "Well, Marcus," Dr. Thomas said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I have to admit, that was a more thoughtful response than I expected. But I wonder, how well do you really understand the broader implications of this theory? How many of you in this room really understand how this theory plays out in the real world, beyond just the textbook examples?" It was a challenge, and one that Marcus knew was coming. The professor had turned the tables, trying to twist the discussion into a way to further discredit him. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him again, but this time, it didn't faze him. He was ready. "I think it's clear that the real-world implications are massive," Marcus responded, his voice unwavering. "People are dying every day because of inequality. People are being left behind. And the fact that we're even discussing this theory, something that's been proven in countless studies, shows how deeply ingrained these systems of oppression are. It's not just an academic exercise, it's a reality for millions." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Marcus had said something that wasn't just academic, it was real. And in that moment, the classroom began to feel different, more alive, more charged. Dr. Thomas's face tightened, his jaw clenched. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by a student who had the nerve to speak up like Marcus did. There was a flicker of something, maybe anger, maybe frustration, in his eyes, but it was quickly masked by his usual calm demeanor. "Well, Marcus," he said, his voice low but filled with venom, "I think we should move on. But I'll keep your comments in mind for our next discussion. Let's see if your understanding holds up under more scrutiny." The room fell silent, and Marcus took his seat. His heart was still racing, but this time it wasn't out of fear, it was out of something stronger. Something that felt like power. He had stood up to Dr. Thomas, and he had done it in front of the whole class. For a brief moment, Marcus allowed himself to breathe. He had won this round. But deep down, he knew the battle was far from over. Dr. Thomas wasn't the kind of person who would let a challenge like this slide. The conflict between them had only just begun. The tension between Marcus and Dr. Thomas didn't dissipate after the lecture. If anything, it intensified. The professor, though outwardly calm, was now more keen on testing Marcus in subtle, increasingly pointed ways. Every lecture felt like a minefield, each question from Dr. Thomas designed to test Marcus's resolve and intelligence, each comment tinged with a hint of condescension. But Marcus wasn't backing down. He had always prided himself on his resilience, on his ability to keep moving forward no matter how many times life knocked him down. It was a mentality that had been instilled in him from a young age. His mother had always told him that no matter how hard things got, as long as you keep moving forward, you'll eventually reach your destination. And Marcus was determined to do just that. Still, it was hard to shake the feeling that something bigger was on the horizon. Dr. Thomas had not only tried to publicly humiliate him but had also made a subtle but clear move to undermine his credibility in front of the class. The way the professor had challenged his response to the economic theory was telling. It wasn't just about the theory itself, but about Marcus's place in the room. He could feel it every time Dr. Thomas looked at him, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Marcus had tried to keep his head down and focus on his studies, but the weight of Dr. Thomas's scrutiny was getting harder to ignore. It wasn't just the lectures, it was everything, the whispers in the hallways, the disapproving glances from some of his classmates, the feeling of being an outsider in a space that was supposed to feel like a place of opportunity. He had worked so hard to get here, to prove that he belonged, but sometimes, the obstacles seemed insurmountable. Then, one evening, Marcus received an email that would change the course of the entire semester. The subject line read, "Final Project Presentation, Professor Thomas's Class, Group Assignment." Marcus had been working on his final project for weeks, a deep dive into racial inequality in America's education system, using data and case studies to highlight the systemic disparities. It was a topic he felt deeply passionate about, one that he had personal experience with, and one that he knew could make an impact if presented well. The assignment was meant to be a collaborative effort. Marcus, though he was used to working alone, had decided to team up with a few classmates who had shown interest in the topic. He had chosen to work with Olivia, a fellow student who had always been friendly and seemed to share his concerns about social issues, and a quiet but sharp student named Jake, who had shown a lot of promise in their earlier discussions. The group was set, and Marcus felt confident about their collective ability to make a strong statement. But then, he noticed something strange. Dr. Thomas had changed the group assignments. Rather than presenting in groups, he decided that each student would present individually. Marcus had been hoping for the support of his peers, especially with the heavy emotional toll that this topic carried. But now, he would have to face Dr. Thomas's scrutiny alone. At first, Marcus thought about the unfairness of it. Was this another move by Dr. Thomas to break him down, to isolate him? The professor knew the stress of the final exam would be high, and now, rather than working in groups, each student had to bear the pressure alone. It felt intentional, and Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Thomas had made this decision just to make things harder for him. It was a daunting prospect, presenting alone. But Marcus refused to be deterred. He had faced obstacles before, and this was just another hurdle to overcome. If anything, it was a chance to show Dr. Thomas, and the rest of the class, that he was more than capable of handling the pressure. The days leading up to the presentation were filled with long nights of preparation. Marcus spent hours refining his slides, practicing his speech, and making sure that every piece of data, every fact, and every argument was flawless. But as much as he worked on the academic aspects of his presentation, he couldn't ignore the emotional weight of what he was about to say. The subject matter hit close to home. It wasn't just an abstract theory to him, it was his life. The inequalities he would be addressing were things he had experienced, things he saw every day. Despite the tension, despite the doubts that sometimes crept in, Marcus knew one thing for certain: he was going to give it his all. He wasn't going to let Dr. Thomas, or anyone else, make him feel like he didn't belong in that space. This was his moment to prove, not just to the professor, but to himself, that he was more than the stereotypes or assumptions people had of him. On the day of the presentation, the classroom felt even colder than usual. As students filtered in, Marcus could feel their eyes on him. Some of them, especially the ones who had been silent during the past few weeks, now seemed more interested than before. He wasn't sure whether they were curious about his topic or whether they were simply watching to see how he would handle the pressure. Either way, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. As he stood before the class, Marcus took a deep breath. Dr. Thomas's eyes were fixed on him, that familiar, calculating gaze watching from the front of the room. He had to admit, the pressure was intense, but Marcus knew he could handle it. He had to. He had no other choice. "Good afternoon, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady. "Today, I'm going to be presenting a project that explores the deep-rooted issues of racial inequality in America's education system. This is not just a subject of academic interest for me, it's personal. I've seen firsthand how these disparities affect students like me, students of color who are constantly faced with barriers that make it harder to succeed in a system that was never built for us." He paused for a moment, looking around the room. He could see that some students were shifting uncomfortably, while others were nodding in agreement. But Dr. Thomas's face remained unreadable. Marcus pushed forward. "This system is designed in such a way that people of color are often denied the same opportunities as their white peers. Whether it's through underfunded schools, biased standardized testing, or a lack of access to quality teachers and resources, the inequalities are glaring. And what's even more alarming is how these disparities are perpetuated over time." As Marcus continued, his confidence grew. He could feel the weight of his words, but they no longer felt like a burden. They were the truth, his truth. He was speaking from experience, from a place of knowing what it was like to struggle in a system that didn't always see him as equal. By the time Marcus reached the conclusion of his presentation, he could sense a shift in the room. The tension had lifted, and the eyes that had once been filled with skepticism or indifference now looked at him with something else: respect. Even Dr. Thomas, who had remained stoic throughout the presentation, seemed to be considering the weight of Marcus's words. And as Marcus finished his speech, he stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of quiet triumph. This wasn't just about winning an academic debate, it was about taking back his dignity. He had done what he set out to do, he had made his voice heard. But as he glanced at Dr. Thomas, he could see the professor's eyes narrowing, as if preparing for the next round. Marcus knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The room was eerily quiet as Marcus wrapped up his presentation. His heart pounded in his chest, but it was a different kind of beat now, a triumphant one. As he stood there, feeling the weight of his words settle in the room, he realized something. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't just fighting to prove his worth to Dr. Thomas, he was fighting to prove it to himself. And in that moment, he had won. But as he slowly made his way back to his seat, there was still a lingering sense of unease. The class seemed to be processing his words, some students exchanging glances, others visibly moved by his speech. Dr. Thomas, however, remained seated behind his desk, his face a mask of neutrality. There was no applause, no sign of acknowledgement, just a long, pregnant silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Marcus sat down, his pulse racing. He knew that what he had just done was bold, and possibly dangerous. There was a chance that Dr. Thomas wouldn't take kindly to being challenged so publicly. But for now, all he could do was wait. "Thank you, Marcus," Dr. Thomas said after a long, uncomfortable pause. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his words. That was, certainly an interesting perspective. The professor's tone was clipped, as though he was trying to maintain control of the situation, but there was something else beneath the surface, something that Marcus couldn't quite pinpoint. The class shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. They were all watching, waiting for the inevitable clash that was about to unfold. Marcus had given his all, and now, there was only one thing left to do: brace for the fallout. The bell rang, signaling the end of the lecture. As the students gathered their things and began to leave, a few lingered, some offering Marcus quick nods of approval. Olivia and Jake both gave him silent, supportive glances, but there was something in the air that felt different now. It wasn't just the usual end-of-class chatter, it felt like the calm before the storm. As Marcus stood up to leave, Dr. Thomas called out to him. "Marcus, a word," he said, his voice colder now, sharper. It wasn't a request. Marcus paused, his stomach sinking. He didn't want to face Dr. Thomas right now, not after everything that had just happened. But there was no avoiding it. He turned and walked toward the professor's desk, his steps measured, his mind racing. When he reached the front of the room, Dr. Thomas was already gathering his papers, his demeanor distant. He didn't look at Marcus at first, instead shuffling some documents into a neat stack. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Dr. Thomas finally said, his voice low, almost mocking. Marcus's breath caught in his throat, but he refused to back down. "I'm just telling the truth." Dr. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. "The truth, Marcus? You've done a fine job of twisting reality into something that fits your narrative. You think the world is against you, against people like you, but you fail to see the bigger picture. You fail to see how your perspective is limited." Marcus clenched his fists at his sides. "My perspective is based on facts, Dr. Thomas. This isn't about me, it's about a system that has oppressed millions of people for centuries." The professor scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Oh, I know all about systemic oppression. But there's more to it than just whining about the past. You need to look beyond the easy answers and actually think critically. You want to talk about inequality? Fine. But don't try to reduce complex social issues to simple anecdotes." Marcus's heart was racing now, his blood boiling. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not reducing anything. I'm calling it out for what it is. People like you hide behind jargon and theories, but the truth is right in front of us. You're the one who's failing to see it." Dr. Thomas's face twisted with something close to disdain. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think your story is the only one that matters, but there are plenty of people who've worked hard, struggled, and succeeded without complaining about their circumstances." Marcus's mind raced as the professor's words stung him. Was this really what Dr. Thomas thought? That all of Marcus's struggles were just complaining? That he was somehow oversimplifying the issue of racial inequality? Marcus had spent his life fighting to be seen as equal, as worthy of the opportunities others had, and yet here was a man, a supposed expert, telling him that his truth didn't matter. This isn't about complaining, Marcus shot back, his voice rising. This is about a system that's rigged, and I'm not going to pretend it's not real just to make people like you feel comfortable. For a moment, there was silence between them. Dr. Thomas's lips curled into a tight smile, but it was empty, like he was playing a game he'd already won. Well, Marcus, it's clear you've made up your mind. Just be careful. The world isn't going to give you what you think you deserve just because you stand up and shout about it. You'll have to work harder than that. With that, Dr. Thomas stood up, as if to signal that the conversation was over. Marcus felt his blood boil, his fists clenched tighter. But he wasn't going to let Dr. Thomas have the last word. He stood tall, looked the professor in the eye, and spoke with a conviction that surprised even him. You're wrong, Dr. Thomas. I'm not waiting for the world to give me anything. I'm going to take it. I'll keep fighting for what's right, and nothing you say will stop me. Dr. Thomas didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned and walked out of the room, leaving Marcus standing there, his mind spinning with a mix of anger, frustration, and determination. As Marcus stood there, staring after the professor, something inside him shifted. He knew this battle wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. The emotional weight of the confrontation with Dr. Thomas had taken its toll, but Marcus also knew that he was stronger than he had been before. This wasn't just about one professor, one class, or even one incident, it was about something much bigger. It was about the fight for his dignity, for his right to be seen, to be heard. And he would not back down. He walked out of the classroom, head held high, ready for whatever was coming next. The days after the confrontation with Dr. Thomas passed in a blur. It wasn't just the intensity of the class or the academic pressure that had Marcus's mind racing, it was the weight of everything he had said, everything he had done. He had been fighting for his right to be heard, for the recognition of his worth, but the repercussions of his outburst were still settling in. Marcus didn't speak to Dr. Thomas again in class, but he could feel the tension whenever the professor's gaze lingered on him. It was like a storm had passed through the classroom, and now, there was a quiet, uneasy calm in its wake. His classmates, too, seemed uncertain of how to approach him. Olivia and Jake were more supportive than ever, but even they noticed the shift in the air. Hey, are you okay? Olivia asked one morning before class, her voice laced with concern. Marcus nodded, though his mind was far from settled. Yeah, just a lot on my mind, you know. I get it, Jake chimed in. That was a big move you made. But you know, you did what you had to do. Marcus appreciated their words, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It wasn't just the confrontation with Dr. Thomas, it was everything. The way people viewed him. The way they saw his passion for social justice as something disruptive, something out of place in an academic setting where logic and reason were supposed to reign. He had always known there were people who wouldn't understand his perspective, but now, that divide felt even deeper. Later that week, Dr. Thomas called for a private meeting. The email had been brief, but it carried a weight that Marcus couldn't ignore. He wasn't sure what to expect, but a part of him knew this conversation was coming. Was the professor going to reprimand him? Was he going to ask him to apologize? When Marcus arrived at Dr. Thomas's office, he found the professor sitting behind his desk, a coffee mug in front of him, his face unreadable. There was no warm greeting, just a gesture toward the empty chair across from him. Sit down, Marcus, Dr. Thomas said, his tone measured but not entirely cold. Marcus took a seat, his posture tense, unsure of where this was going. He had no idea if Dr. Thomas was going to apologize or reprimand him, but he had to face whatever came next. For a long while, Dr. Thomas didn't say anything. He just stared at Marcus, his gaze intense but not entirely hostile. The silence in the room was suffocating, and Marcus felt his heart beat faster with every passing second. Finally, Dr. Thomas spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about our last conversation. About what you said. You know, when you presented your final project." Marcus swallowed. "What about it?" "I didn't agree with your perspective, but," Dr. Thomas trailed off, his fingers drumming the side of his mug. "I think I misunderstood something. You were right to stand up for yourself. I've been too focused on theory and detaching myself from real-world issues, especially ones that don't fit into neatly packaged academic boxes." Marcus blinked, taken aback. "You're saying you understand?" Dr. Thomas sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I don't know if I fully understand, Marcus. But I'm willing to listen. And that's a start. I've spent my career teaching about systems, about structures, but I've failed to recognize how those very systems impact real people, real lives. Your presentation made me realize that. Maybe my own biases have clouded my judgment." Marcus was silent for a moment, trying to process Dr. Thomas's words. This wasn't the professor he knew, the man who had challenged him at every turn, who had made him feel less than, like his voice didn't matter. This was different. "I appreciate that," Marcus said quietly, though a part of him still felt wary. "But it's not just about me, Dr. Thomas. It's about the people who don't get a chance to stand up and speak out. People who go unheard every day." Dr. Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "I know. I'm beginning to see that now. The problem is bigger than just you and me, and I failed to acknowledge that." For a long time, there was a pause between them. Marcus wasn't sure where this conversation would go, but something about the way Dr. Thomas spoke made him believe that, for once, the professor was actually listening. He wasn't just waiting for the chance to dismiss him, to diminish his experience. Instead, there was an openness there, a willingness to engage that had never been there before. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Dr. Thomas said, breaking the silence. "But I want you to know that I've learned something from you. And I'll do better moving forward." Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't know if Dr. Thomas's words would hold any real weight, but for the first time, he felt like there was a chance for change. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly didn't erase the tension that had been between them, but it was a start. Before Marcus left, Dr. Thomas looked at him one last time, his gaze soft but firm. "Keep speaking your truth, Marcus. Keep challenging me, and the system. You're right to do so." Marcus left the professor's office with mixed feelings, relief, confusion, and a sense of cautious optimism. He wasn't sure what to make of the conversation. Was Dr. Thomas's sudden shift in tone genuine? Or was it just an attempt to save face after the public confrontation? But as Marcus walked back to his dorm, he couldn't help but feel a little lighter. Even if Dr. Thomas never fully understood him, at least he was willing to listen. And in a world where so many people refused to listen to voices like his, that felt like progress. The next few days passed quickly. Marcus continued his studies, his resolve strengthened by the conversation with Dr. Thomas. But things didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. There was still work to be done, still injustices to fight, but now Marcus understood something he hadn't before: change didn't always happen in big, dramatic moments. Sometimes, it came in quiet conversations, in small acts of understanding. And as he sat down to study one night, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle. He had stood up for himself and for others who had been silenced. He had fought to be seen, to be heard, and that fight wasn't over. But he had learned something important along the way: change took time, and sometimes, it started with just one person being brave enough to speak their truth. Marcus smiled, his eyes focused on the pages in front of him. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. And that was enough. The days that followed Marcus's meeting with Dr. Thomas felt surreal. It was as if the universe had conspired to give him a moment of clarity, a brief reprieve from the tension that had dominated his life for so long. Yet, the feeling was fleeting. Life, as it always did, moved forward, and Marcus knew that one conversation with a professor wouldn't solve everything. That very week, something unexpected happened. On a Wednesday afternoon, Marcus was sitting in the student lounge with Olivia and Jake, catching up on their coursework, when a familiar face appeared. It was Samantha, a quiet student from their history class who had always kept to herself. She wasn't the type to get involved in public debates, and for the most part, Marcus had only exchanged a few words with her in passing. But today, there was something different in her expression, a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Hey, Marcus," Samantha said, her voice soft but clear. She had a small, nervous smile on her face. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Marcus looked up, puzzled. "Sure, what's up?" "I just wanted to say, thank you. For what you did in Dr. Thomas's class last week," she said, sitting down across from him. "I know it wasn't easy, and I've been thinking about it a lot." Jake raised an eyebrow but remained silent. Olivia, on the other hand, seemed to notice something about Samantha's demeanor. "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, leaning forward. "You weren't one of the people who disagreed with Marcus, were you?" Samantha shook her head, clearly uncomfortable. "No, I wasn't. But I'll be honest, I never thought I had a voice in class. I always keep quiet because I don't think anyone cares about what I have to say. And after last week, when you challenged Dr. Thomas, I just felt like maybe it's okay to speak up, even if I'm not sure I'll be heard." Marcus was taken aback. He had no idea that his words had impacted someone like Samantha, someone who hadn't shown much outward interest in social issues before. "I didn't think anyone was paying attention to me, honestly," he said, his voice softening. "I just had to say what I believed was right. But I guess it doesn't matter whether or not you think people are paying attention. You just have to do it, you know." Samantha nodded slowly, the wheels turning in her mind. "I've been sitting in the back of class, not saying anything, because I didn't want to make waves. But after hearing you, it's like I realize that silence isn't always the answer. I want to start speaking up more, about what I believe in, about what I've seen. I think I've been too scared to make people uncomfortable, but now I'm starting to think that maybe making people uncomfortable is part of making change happen." Olivia smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "That's amazing, Samantha. I think a lot of people feel the same way. But it takes courage to say something, especially when you're not sure how it will be received." "I don't know if I'll ever be as bold as you, Marcus," Samantha continued, her gaze shifting to him. "But seeing you stand up for yourself and for what you believe in, it made me realize that maybe I don't have to stay silent anymore. So, I just wanted to thank you." Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He had always believed in the power of speaking out, but hearing how his actions had inspired someone else, someone who had never seemed outspoken before, was something he hadn't expected. It was one thing to challenge Dr. Thomas, but it was another thing entirely to realize that his actions were creating a ripple effect, spreading beyond the walls of the classroom and reaching others who needed the courage to speak up. "Don't thank me, Samantha," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got a voice of your own. You just have to use it." In the days that followed, more students began to approach Marcus with similar sentiments. Some were classmates he had never interacted with before, others were people who had always remained in the background, unsure if their voices were worth hearing. But one by one, they came forward, thanking him, telling him how his bravery had inspired them to find their own. Each conversation was different, but they all had one thing in common: Marcus's words had sparked something inside them. The idea that it was okay to stand up for what they believed in, even in the face of opposition, had been ignited. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and suddenly, the entire atmosphere around him seemed to change. The ripple effect wasn't just in the classroom anymore. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed a shift on campus. More students were speaking out, raising their voices in discussions about inequality, injustice, and social change. The quiet corners of the university were filled with conversation and debate, and Marcus couldn't help but feel that, somehow, his own small act of defiance had played a role in this transformation. It wasn't just the students who noticed the shift. Faculty members, including those who had once been critical of Marcus's approach, began to take notice as well. Dr. Thomas, while still maintaining a distance, seemed to adopt a more open approach in his lectures, encouraging students to engage with the material in a more personal way, to see beyond the theoretical and into the lived experiences of others. One afternoon, after class, Dr. Thomas called Marcus over again. This time, the professor's demeanor was less guarded. There was no defensive edge to his voice, just a genuine curiosity. "Marcus," he began, "I've been thinking about something you said a few weeks ago. About how history can't be understood without recognizing the personal impact it has on people. You were right. I've spent so many years focusing on theory that I've forgotten the human side of things. I want to thank you for reminding me of that." Marcus was stunned. Dr. Thomas was admitting that he had been wrong, and that kind of honesty wasn't something Marcus had expected from the professor. It felt like a sign of growth, not just for Marcus but for Dr. Thomas as well. "Maybe we all need to do a little more listening," Marcus said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe we need to take the time to hear the stories that don't always fit into the textbook." Dr. Thomas nodded, looking at Marcus with something resembling respect. "You've been a catalyst for something important here. Don't forget that." As Marcus left Dr. Thomas's office that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment. The challenges he had faced, the opposition, the doubt, had all led to something bigger. His personal fight had become a movement, a spark that was igniting change on a larger scale. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about all the voices that had been waiting to be heard. And now, more people were stepping forward, using their voices, embracing their power. And Marcus knew, deep in his heart, that this was only the beginning. The classroom had been the battleground, but the world was the canvas. And now, Marcus realized that the paintbrush was in the hands of many, not just one. The weeks that followed Marcus's confrontation with Dr. Thomas were filled with unexpected developments. While some students began to speak up more freely, emboldened by Marcus's example, not everyone shared in the excitement of this newfound openness. In fact, the ripple effect wasn't always one of encouragement. There were whispers. Conversations that turned cold when Marcus entered the room. Students who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact. He noticed it, but said nothing. He had been warned that standing up for what you believe in could sometimes make you a target. But the isolation felt heavier than he had expected. One afternoon, as Marcus walked through the hallways of the university, his phone buzzed with a notification from Olivia. "You okay?" He didn't immediately respond. His eyes were drawn to a group of students standing near the bulletin board in the student lounge, laughing at something. One of them, a guy named Ben, who had been in Dr. Thomas's class, spotted Marcus and paused. Ben's gaze lingered on Marcus for a moment, a smirk slowly forming on his face. Marcus had seen that look before. It was the kind of look someone gave when they thought you were insignificant, when they had judged you from the outside and decided they knew who you were without even trying to understand. Ben's friends began to laugh too, glancing in Marcus's direction. It was subtle, but it wasn't missed. The group began to make their way toward Marcus. Marcus wasn't in the mood for confrontation, not after everything that had happened. But it seemed like they weren't going to let him go without a jab. "Hey, Marcus," Ben said with a mock-friendly tone. "Did you get everything you wanted out of your little outburst in class?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He kept his head high, his expression neutral. He had learned not to let people like Ben see how much their words affected him. "Yeah, I heard you made things interesting," Ben continued, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in his voice. "Sure, you might have gotten the attention you wanted, but at what cost? A knot tightened in Marcus's stomach. He could feel his fists clench, but he didn't let his anger show. Ben's words were just another form of silencing him, another way to put him back in his place. But Marcus wasn't willing to let that happen. "I'm not interested in your opinion, Ben," Marcus said, his voice calm, but firm. Ben's smirk widened. "Of course you're not. You never listen to anyone else. You just make everything about you." Before Marcus could respond, Olivia appeared from behind him, stepping in between him and Ben. "You want to keep running your mouth, Ben? Maybe try it somewhere else. Marcus doesn't have to explain himself to you. Not anymore." Ben scoffed, clearly taken aback by Olivia's intervention. "Whatever," he muttered, rolling his eyes before walking off with his friends. Olivia turned to Marcus, her face showing a mix of concern and frustration. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heartbeat. "Yeah. It's just. I don't know, Liv. It's hard. I thought things would get better, but it feels like I'm just becoming more of a target." Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a comforting squeeze. "I know it's tough. But don't let them win. You've done something important. You've started a conversation that wasn't happening before. And yeah, not everyone is going to like it. But that's how change works. It makes people uncomfortable." Marcus nodded, grateful for her words. He knew she was right. Change wasn't meant to be easy, and it wasn't going to come without resistance. But it was still hard, feeling like the target of that resistance. Later that evening, as Marcus sat alone in his dorm room, he found himself scrolling through social media, checking for any new posts about the incident. It wasn't something he liked doing, but he couldn't help it. His mind kept going back to what had happened in Dr. Thomas's class and the ripple effect it had created. The conversation was supposed to be a catalyst for change, but there were always people who fought against that change. He knew that. To his surprise, one of the posts he came across wasn't negative. It was a screenshot of a tweet from a former classmate, a student named Nadia, who had left the university a few semesters ago to pursue activism. The tweet read, "Real change happens when you stand up, even when you're standing alone. Shout out to Marcus for showing us what courage looks like. The fight isn't over, but it's only just begun." Marcus stared at the tweet for a long time. It wasn't from someone he knew well, but it felt like a validation he hadn't expected. Nadia had seen what he did, and she understood. It was a small gesture, but in a time when he felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, it meant everything. He sat back in his chair and took a deep breath. This fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. The next day, Marcus walked into his sociology class with a renewed sense of purpose. There were still whispers, still looks that made him feel like an outsider. But today, he was ready. He had come to realize something important during the long night he spent reflecting. The price of change was discomfort, but it was a price worth paying. As he sat down at his desk, Olivia slid into the seat beside him, her eyes bright. "You good?" "Yeah," Marcus said, offering her a genuine smile. "I think I'm getting used to it." The professor, Mrs. Jenkins, began the lecture. Marcus focused on the words being spoken, but his mind kept drifting back to the conversation he'd had with Nadia. To the people who were still listening. To the ones who hadn't yet found their voice but were waiting for the courage to speak. He was starting to understand what true change meant. It wasn't about making everyone happy. It wasn't about being liked. It was about making the uncomfortable conversation happen. It was about challenging the status quo, about forcing people to think, even if it meant stepping on a few toes along the way. As class continued, Marcus's thoughts remained clear. He wasn't done. This was only the beginning, and the road ahead might be even harder than he imagined, but he wasn't going to stop. Because change was never easy, and it never came without a price. But for the first time in his life, Marcus was ready to pay it. The feeling of isolation had been replaced with a burning determination, a resolve stronger than he'd ever known. And as he left the classroom that day, Marcus didn't just walk out as a student. He walked out as someone who had changed the conversation, and someone who would continue to change it, no matter what. The weeks after the confrontation with Dr. Thomas continued to bring both challenges and growth for Marcus. As he stepped deeper into the unknown terrain of social change, he found that there was more to it than simply speaking out. It was about maintaining the courage to keep going even when the momentum seemed to stall, and even when the support seemed to dwindle. The pressure was mounting. Marcus noticed how certain professors, including those he once admired, seemed to view him differently. There was a subtle shift in their treatment of him. Some avoided making eye contact, others gave curt nods instead of the warm greetings they once offered. The university, a place he had once felt welcomed in, was now beginning to feel like a cold, unfamiliar place. One afternoon, as Marcus walked to the library with Olivia, his thoughts were heavy. He had been trying to focus on his studies, but it was hard when every class felt like a reminder of the battle he was fighting, not just for himself, but for every student whose voice had been ignored for far too long. "You've been quiet lately," Olivia observed, her voice cutting through his thoughts. "You all right?" He glanced at her and let out a long sigh. "I don't know, Liv. It's like, everything I do is met with resistance now. I thought speaking out would make people see things differently, but I feel like I'm being treated like a troublemaker." "Marcus," Olivia said gently, "you are making people uncomfortable. And that's a good thing. It means you're making them think. You're challenging the way things have always been, and not everyone is ready for that. But don't let that discourage you." Marcus stopped walking for a moment, turning to face her. "I'm not discouraged," he said. I don't know if I can keep pushing when it feels like I'm the only one doing it." Olivia gave him a pointed look. "You're not alone, Marcus. Maybe it feels like it right now, but you're not. You've inspired more people than you realize. It's just that the changes you're making aren't going to happen overnight." Marcus nodded slowly. "I guess I just didn't realize how lonely this would feel. I thought there would be more people standing with me." "I'm here with you," Olivia said, her voice resolute. "And I know other people are too. But the thing about change is that it doesn't always look like what you expect it to. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's quiet. But that doesn't mean it's not happening." They continued walking toward the library, and as Marcus thought about Olivia's words, he couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude. She had been there through everything, supporting him, encouraging him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. But as much as he appreciated her presence, he knew this battle was his alone to fight. Later that day, Marcus found himself in the student lounge, scrolling through his phone again. The posts about his confrontation with Dr. Thomas had started to slow down, but there were still a few that stood out. One caught his attention, a tweet from Nadia. "Change isn't just about being heard. It's about surviving the consequences of being heard. Keep going, Marcus. You're stronger than you think." It was a simple message, but it struck a chord with Marcus. Nadia understood. She knew that the path to change was not an easy one. It was about endurance. About surviving the consequences. It wasn't just the students who were starting to notice Marcus. Over the next few days, a couple of professors reached out to him privately. Some offered quiet support, while others, like Dr. Williams, a professor from his sociology class, gave him a new perspective on what was happening. "Marcus," Dr. Williams said after class one afternoon, pulling him aside. "I've been watching you for the past few weeks. I know you've been getting some negative feedback, but I want you to understand something. What you did in Dr. Thomas's class was powerful. It was uncomfortable for some, yes. But that's because you forced them to confront something they didn't want to see." Marcus stood silently, absorbing the weight of Dr. Williams's words. "Look, I'm not going to pretend that you haven't made waves on this campus. People are talking about what you said. Some agree, some don't. But that's the point. The discussion is happening. And that is how change starts. Marcus felt a sense of relief wash over him. It was one thing to hear that from Olivia, but to hear it from a professor, someone with authority, felt different. He wasn't imagining it. He was actually making an impact. You're doing good work, Marcus. Keep pushing forward, Dr. Williams continued. And if you ever need a sounding board, I'm here. The reassurance was exactly what Marcus needed. But as he walked back to his dorm that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else at play. It wasn't just the professors or the students who were resisting his efforts. There were other, more unseen forces at work, forces that didn't want to see him succeed. For days, he felt a vague but persistent pressure. Subtle at first, but it was beginning to take shape. It wasn't just about his classmates or even Dr. Thomas anymore. There were powers within the university itself that didn't want things to change. The board members, the administration, those who kept the structure of the university intact, didn't want a disruption. They didn't want the reputation of the institution to be tarnished by controversy. Late one night, Marcus received an email that sent a chill down his spine. It was a message from the dean of students, requesting a meeting the next morning. The subject line was simple: meeting request, student conduct. He stared at the email for a moment, heart pounding. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation with the administration. After everything he had already been through, the thought of facing the dean made him feel more isolated than ever. What do you think they want? Olivia asked when he told her. I'm not sure, Marcus replied. But I have a feeling it's not going to be good. I've been stirring up a lot of conversations, and not all of them are positive. Olivia bit her lip, concern written all over her face. You've got this, Marcus. But whatever happens, I'll be right there with you. The next morning, Marcus walked into the dean's office, his mind racing. The room was cold, the walls lined with portraits of past deans and university alumni, their eyes following him as he stepped inside. The dean, a stern man in his 50s with sharp eyes, sat behind a large wooden desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Marcus, the dean said, his voice flat, please, have a seat. Marcus took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was about to come. He had been prepared for pushback, but there was something about this meeting that felt different, more serious. Let's get to the point, the dean said. Your actions in Dr. Thomas's class and the aftermath have sparked a lot of conversation. While we support freedom of speech, some members of the faculty and student body have raised concerns about your conduct. Specifically, there have been complaints about the way you've disrupted the classroom environment. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but he remained calm. I'm not here to disrupt anyone. I'm here to speak up about things that matter, things that are uncomfortable, but important. The dean's gaze didn't soften. I understand that, but we must also consider the broader impact. There are rules, guidelines we must adhere to. And right now, some are concerned that your actions might be crossing a line. Marcus straightened in his chair, the words ready on his tongue. He knew he was standing at a crossroads, he could either back down, or he could stand firm. He had already made his choice. If you're asking me to stop speaking out, then I won't. This is about something bigger than me. It's about making sure that people's voices are heard, even when it's uncomfortable. The dean's expression remained impassive, but Marcus could see the flicker of something behind his eyes. Was it respect? Or was it something else? He wasn't sure. You'll be hearing from us soon, the dean said. This is just a preliminary discussion. But be aware, Marcus, that this matter will not be dismissed lightly. Marcus nodded, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He wasn't done yet. Whatever happened next, he would stand his ground. As he left the office, Marcus couldn't help but think, this is what it costs to change things. This is what it feels like to challenge the system. And he was ready for whatever came next. The days following his meeting with the dean felt like a blur to Marcus. He was hyper-aware of every step he took on campus, noticing the glances, the whispers, the weight of every silent interaction. The pressure was mounting, and the tension was palpable. His phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from his friends, but there was a growing sense of unease that tugged at him as well. He could feel the eyes of the university on him now, more so than ever before. It was no longer just about a disagreement in class, it had become a larger issue, one that was out of his hands in many ways. The administration's warning loomed over him, a constant reminder that change could come at a very high price. As he sat in his dorm room late one evening, staring at the wall, the reality of his situation hit him harder than it ever had before. He had thought that speaking out would spark immediate action, that things would change quickly. But it was becoming clear that there were forces in play that would do everything they could to keep things as they were, even if it meant silencing the voices that demanded change. His phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. It was Olivia. "Hey, what's up?" he answered, trying to sound normal, though he knew she could tell something was off. "I just talked to Nadia," Olivia said, her voice sounding a little strained. "She told me that she's been hearing some things. There are rumors that the administration might be trying to make an example out of you. They're considering disciplinary action." Marcus's stomach dropped. He had known it was coming, but hearing it confirmed made everything feel so much more real. The very thing he had been dreading, the thing he had feared would happen if he kept pushing for change, was now knocking at his door. Disciplinary action. For what? He asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to keep it steady. Olivia paused. "They're claiming that your behavior in Dr. Thomas's class was disruptive. And, I don't know, there's talk about you causing a disturbance on campus. Basically, they're framing it as though you're a troublemaker." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a tightness in his chest. "That's insane. I wasn't disruptive. I was just speaking the truth. Why can't they see that?" "I don't know," Olivia replied softly. "But it's not just about what's right anymore, Marcus. It's about power. And right now, they have it. You're challenging the way they've always done things, and they don't like it. The question is, are you ready for the fight that's coming? Because it's going to get harder." The weight of her words settled over him. He had already been battling for change, but this was different. This was no longer just about confronting Dr. Thomas in a single class. This was about the university system itself, a system that had been built on centuries of tradition, one that wasn't going to relinquish its power without a fight. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I'm not backing down, Liv. I can't. But I need to be ready for what comes next. And right now, I don't know what that looks like." "We'll figure it out," Olivia said firmly. "You're not in this alone, Marcus. I've got your back." "Thanks, Liv. I mean it." The next morning, Marcus woke up with a sense of dread hanging over him. The meeting with the dean had left him shaken, but it was the uncertainty of what was coming next that gnawed at him. He dressed in silence, moving through the motions as he prepared for another day, but the reality of his situation loomed larger than ever. What if this wasn't just a passing moment of resistance? What if it was the beginning of something much bigger, a fight for his future? As he walked to campus, he passed by several students who looked at him, some with curious expressions, others with narrowed eyes. He had become something of a symbol, both admired and feared. And though he had never asked for that role, he realized that it was one he would have to navigate if he was going to continue fighting for what he believed in. In the cafeteria later that day, Marcus sat with Olivia and a few other friends. The conversation was light at first, but it didn't take long for the topic to shift. "So, have you heard?" one of their classmates, Sarah, asked. "There's talk that the administration is going to take disciplinary action against you. It's all over the campus." Marcus bristled but kept his voice steady. "Yeah, I've heard. They don't like that I'm speaking out. That's not the half of it, Sarah said, leaning in closer. There's talk that they might expel you. They're trying to make an example of you. Olivia shook her head. That's not going to happen. We're going to fight this. Marcus remained silent, trying to process the weight of the conversation. Expulsion? The thought was so surreal that he couldn't fully grasp it. But the reality was beginning to set in. This wasn't just about making a point anymore, it was about surviving the system that was trying to silence him. As they continued to talk, the tension in Marcus's chest didn't dissipate. Instead, it grew. This wasn't just about Dr. Thomas anymore. It was about the very institution he had chosen to be a part of. And the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. The following week, Marcus found himself sitting in the same office where he had first been called in by the dean. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. The dean's demeanor was colder, more formal, as if the previous discussion had been just the beginning of a much larger issue. There were other members of the administration in the room now, higher-ups who looked at him with a mix of skepticism and, perhaps, concern. Marcus, the dean said, his tone devoid of warmth. As you know, your actions in Dr. Thomas's class have raised significant concerns. It has come to our attention that your behavior is not aligning with the values we uphold at this institution. Marcus sat up straighter, trying to stay calm, but every fiber of his being was on edge. He had anticipated this, but now that he was facing it, the words felt like a punch to the gut. I was speaking out against injustice, Marcus replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. If that's what you call disruptive behavior, then maybe this institution isn't what I thought it was. The room grew tense, and the administrators exchanged looks. The dean cleared his throat. We understand your intent, Marcus. But your actions have consequences, and those consequences must be addressed. There have been multiple complaints, and we cannot ignore them. We are considering disciplinary action. Marcus felt his heart race. What kind of action? There are several options, one of the administrators, a woman with sharp features, said. We're looking into everything from a formal reprimand to a suspension. We'll be reviewing the matter in the coming days. Marcus didn't know what to say. He had known this was coming, but hearing it laid out so plainly made it all the more real. He could feel the walls closing in on him, but in that moment, something clicked. He had been fighting so hard to be heard, to make his point known. But now, as he faced the harsh reality of what was at stake, he realized that the fight wasn't just about changing the system, it was about surviving it. I'm not backing down, Marcus said firmly, his voice unwavering. If you want to expel me, then so be it. But I will not apologize for standing up for what's right. The dean and the others exchanged looks again, but this time, there was something else in their eyes. Respect? Or maybe something more. Whatever it was, Marcus could feel it, the realization that this fight wasn't over. They might try to silence him, but he wasn't going to stop. As Marcus left the office, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The road ahead was uncertain, and the stakes had never been higher. But one thing was clear, no matter what the administration decided, he would keep fighting. Change was never easy, but it was always worth the fight. And Marcus was ready for whatever came next. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days following Marcus's meeting with the administration felt like a pressure cooker slowly coming to a boil. Every moment seemed charged with anticipation, as though he were waiting for the other shoe to drop. He couldn't stop thinking about what the dean had said, about the possible consequences of his actions. The threat of suspension, even expulsion, hung over him like a dark cloud. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everything he had fought for and what would happen if the system won. Marcus didn't sleep much that week. He spent most of his nights in his dorm room, combing through articles and books on student activism, on civil rights, on people who had fought against systems of power. He needed to remind himself why he had started this fight in the first place, and why it was worth every ounce of the pressure he felt. His mission had never been about getting attention, it had always been about bringing justice, about speaking truth to power, even if that truth was uncomfortable. The constant notifications on his phone, texts, emails, and social media messages, reminded him that people were watching. Some messages were encouraging, others hostile. Some were simply neutral, just people who didn't know where they stood. But the most powerful were the messages from students he didn't even know, who expressed solidarity. He found it hard to ignore the voices of those who reached out to him privately, telling him how his courage had inspired them to speak up too, to challenge their own silence. In some ways, these messages were the only thing keeping him going. But in other ways, they were the ones that made him feel the weight of his own responsibility. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for everyone who felt like their voice didn't matter. The pressure to be the change was immense. He sat at the student union the day after the meeting with the administration, trying to find some normalcy in his routine. Olivia sat across from him, flipping through a notebook, but she kept glancing up at him as though she was trying to gauge his thoughts. "You good?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus shook his head slightly, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I'm so tired, Liv. Tired of waiting. I know something's coming. I just don't know when or what it's going to be." "You can't keep carrying all this by yourself," Olivia said softly, her voice a little more serious. "I get that this is your fight, but you don't have to fight alone. People are behind you." "I know," Marcus replied, his eyes meeting hers. "But this is bigger than me now. I never imagined it would be like this. All the eyes on me, the pressure from the administration. I'm not sure I can keep up this fight if it keeps escalating." The words hung between them, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Olivia's eyes softened. "Marcus, I don't want you to think this is about doing everything perfectly. No one expects you to have all the answers, or to be this unshakable pillar of strength. All we want is for you to stay true to yourself." But even as Olivia said these words, Marcus couldn't help but wonder if his true self could bear the weight of the responsibility. Could one person truly change a system? And if they did, what would that cost them? That afternoon, Marcus headed to the campus library to meet with a few students who had been organizing with him. They had set up a small meeting to discuss what their next steps should be. But when he walked into the room, he was surprised to find Nadia sitting there, looking tense and troubled. "Hey," Marcus greeted, taking a seat next to her. "You okay?" Nadia nodded, but there was a certain weariness in her eyes. "I've been hearing some things about you, Marcus. There's talk, serious talk, that they might not just suspend you. People in the administration are trying to push for you to be expelled." Marcus leaned forward, his heart tightening. The rumor had already spread. "Expelled?" He repeated the word slowly, trying to wrap his mind around it. "Yeah, it's what they're pushing for now. There are people who think this could set an important precedent, that if they expel you, it'll send a message to anyone else thinking of challenging the system." Nadia's voice dropped lower, as if the words themselves were dangerous. Marcus felt his breath catch. Expulsion. It seemed like a distant possibility just a week ago, but now it was right there, staring him in the face. The reality of what was at stake suddenly hit him harder than ever before. "What do we do?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Nadia shook her head. "I don't know. But I think it's time we escalate this. We can't let them think they can just silence you." The other students around the table were nodding in agreement, their faces a mix of resolve and fear. Marcus knew that things had gone beyond the point of no return. If they were going to fight this, they would have to be all in, no backing down. "I don't want this to be about me," Marcus said, standing up, pacing in front of the group. It's not about one person. It's about all of us. It's about the system. I won't let them make an example of me just to keep things quiet. Nadia's eyes met his, and she smiled faintly. Then we fight. We make sure they know this isn't over until we say it is. And just like that, the path was set. The students in the room agreed to take action, organizing protests, creating petitions, and pushing the administration to be accountable for the way they were treating Marcus. They knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were committed to the cause. What started as a lone voice in one classroom had now become a collective movement, a movement that had the potential to shake the foundations of their university. Later that night, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from Dr. Williams, the professor who had privately expressed his support in the past. Marcus. I've been following what's been happening over the past few weeks, and I know you're facing some serious challenges. I wanted to let you know that I support you, and I believe what you're doing is important. I also believe that the university is failing to see the bigger picture in all of this. We have a responsibility to protect our students and their right to speak out against injustice, even if it makes us uncomfortable. If you need anything, whether it's advice, support, or someone to talk to, please don't hesitate to reach out. You're not alone in this. Dr. Williams. Marcus sat there for a moment, staring at the screen. The words felt like a lifeline in the midst of the chaos. He wasn't alone. It wasn't just Olivia, Nadia, and a few friends who had his back. There were people in the faculty, people with power and influence, who saw the truth of what was happening and were willing to stand with him. His heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and determination. Maybe this fight wasn't just about surviving it, it was about proving that even when systems tried to crush voices, those voices could rise up again. And with the right people behind him, Marcus wasn't about to let it all crumble. As he shut his laptop, a sense of clarity washed over him. The administration might have tried to silence him, but he wasn't done. The fight for justice was far from over, and he would not stop until the university was forced to hear the truth. No matter what happened next, Marcus knew one thing for sure: he was not alone, and together, they would keep pushing forward. The momentum Marcus and his fellow activists had built began to gain force in ways they hadn't anticipated. Word spread quickly about the university's attempts to silence Marcus. What began as a small student movement soon became a groundswell, with students from across the campus rallying together, drawn by the injustice they felt was unfolding before them. Even students who had initially been indifferent to the issue were starting to pay attention. It was no longer just about one student standing up against a professor, it was about the very rights that students were entitled to, the right to speak freely, to challenge authority, and to demand justice. The protests were carefully planned, not just in terms of their visibility but in their messaging. They weren't just demanding Marcus's case be dropped. They were demanding that the university reevaluate how it treated its students, especially students who spoke up against entrenched power structures. Marcus had not planned to become a leader. He had only wanted to speak the truth. But now, he stood at the front of a growing student movement, his name becoming a symbol of resistance. It was a chilly Friday afternoon when the first protest was scheduled. The students had gathered in the central quad, the heart of the campus, right outside the administration building. They held signs demanding justice for Marcus and "Students speak up, silence no more." There were chants in the air, a constant hum of energy and frustration, but there was also a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about a single student anymore, it was about the broader fight for accountability in an institution that seemed hellbent on preserving the status quo. Marcus stood on the periphery, taking it all in. He felt a mix of awe and trepidation. He had always been a participant in protests and student activism, but this was different. This was his cause, and it was much larger than he had ever imagined. He looked over at Olivia, who was standing next to him with her phone in hand, organizing the next steps of the protest through group chats. "How's it going?" Marcus asked, trying to sound calm. Olivia gave him a tight smile. "It's going." More people are showing up than we expected. The university won't be able to ignore this much longer. Marcus nodded. I just hope we're doing the right thing. What if this gets out of hand? What if the administration uses this as an excuse to go even harder on me? They can try, Olivia said, her voice resolute. But you've already shown them you won't back down. We're just here to support you, Marcus. We've got your back. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was too busy watching the students around him, their faces painted with passion, with the desire for change. They weren't afraid. That was something he had to remember. They were doing this because they knew what it felt like to have their voices unheard, to be dismissed, to be silenced. They were fighting for the same rights Marcus was. Before he could say anything else, the sound of footsteps reached his ears. A group of faculty members, including some professors who had attended the initial meeting with the dean, were walking toward him. There was no mistaking their purpose, they had come to confront him. The tension in the air grew heavier, like a storm was on the horizon. Marcus, Dr. Williams said, approaching with a serious expression. I thought I'd find you here. Marcus gave him a respectful nod. I had to make sure my voice was heard. Dr. Williams sighed, looking around at the growing crowd. This is risky, Marcus. You know the administration is watching. If this escalates any further, they'll use it as a reason to tighten their grip. You don't want to be the reason students get caught in the crossfire. Marcus clenched his jaw but held his ground. I'm not trying to cause chaos, Dr. Williams. I'm trying to make them see that we deserve better. This university can't keep punishing students for speaking out. That's not what we're here for. Dr. Williams studied him for a moment, his brow furrowed. I understand. But be careful. I've seen how this plays out, Marcus. The administration will not hesitate to make an example out of you if they think it will silence the rest of the student body. I know, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. But I won't back down. Not now. Dr. Williams seemed to hesitate before giving a slow nod. I'm not here to tell you to stop, Marcus. But I need you to understand the full consequences of your actions. Before Marcus could respond, the sharp sound of a whistle pierced the air, cutting through the murmur of voices. A campus security officer stepped forward, signaling the start of the protest's official shutdown. It was clear that the administration had decided to take action sooner rather than later. The students around Marcus tensed, but they didn't move. They were ready to stand their ground, to face whatever came next. But Marcus could see that not all of them were prepared for the consequences. He could feel the pressure mounting again, the weight of leadership weighing heavily on his shoulders. I won't let them scare us, Marcus said, stepping forward with a newfound determination. We've come this far, and we won't stop now. If they want to shut us down, they'll have to do it themselves. The crowd erupted into applause, and soon, chants filled the air again. The security officers were left standing, unsure of how to proceed, and for a few minutes, it seemed like the university's might had no effect on the growing momentum of the students. Marcus stood tall, his chest rising with each chant that resonated around him. For the first time, he felt not just like a student caught in a conflict, but like a leader. And he realized that leadership wasn't just about making speeches or organizing protests. It was about standing in the face of intimidation, knowing the stakes, and refusing to be silenced. In the days that followed, the university's response to the protests was swift and harsh. They issued statements condemning the protests, and campus security began to monitor all gatherings more closely. The university's official stance was that the protests had disrupted the learning environment, though many students saw through this thin excuse. The administration wasn't interested in fostering open dialogue, they were more concerned with maintaining control. Marcus knew they would try to escalate their response. The question was, would the student body continue to rise up against it, or would the fear of retaliation silence them once again? As he sat in his dorm room that evening, staring at his reflection in the window, he could feel the weight of it all. He wasn't sure what was coming next, but he knew that he couldn't stop. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. The email from Dr. Williams echoed in his mind. His mentor had been right. The administration would try to shut him down. But Marcus was more determined than ever. He had started this fight not for recognition or accolades, but because he believed in what was right. And now, more than ever, he couldn't back down. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? He thought, the phrase from the beginning of his journey running through his head. He wasn't alone. And together, they were going to keep pushing forward. As the days went by, the protests didn't subside, they intensified. What had started as a small group of students had now grown into a large-scale movement, one that reached the attention of not only the university administration but also local media outlets. Articles and news reports began to surface, painting Marcus as both a hero and a troublemaker. Some praised him for his courage in challenging authority, while others accused him of stoking unrest and jeopardizing the campus's sense of order. Marcus was no stranger to being misunderstood. But now, the stakes had escalated. The media frenzy was relentless, and his personal life became the subject of public debate. His social media accounts, once a place for casual posts, were flooded with comments, some encouraging, others cruel. His friends tried to shield him from the worst of it, but the messages still found their way to him, each one like another brick being thrown at the walls he was desperately trying to hold up. The pressure was taking its toll. Marcus found himself exhausted, his focus wavering. He had become so consumed by the fight that he had neglected his own well-being. The late nights spent organizing, strategizing, and answering messages left him with little time to rest. And as much as he told himself he had to keep going for the cause, there were moments when he wondered if it was all worth it. One evening, as Marcus walked back to his dorm after a particularly draining day of meetings, he couldn't shake the sense of dread that had been hanging over him for weeks. The campus was quieter than usual, and the weight of the silence seemed to settle on his shoulders. It felt as though everything he had worked for was teetering on the edge of collapse, and the pressure to maintain the movement, to keep everyone together, was more than he could bear. When he reached his room, Olivia was already there, pacing nervously. "You okay?" she asked when she saw the exhaustion on his face. Marcus sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I feel like I'm losing control of everything. The protests are getting bigger, the media is spinning everything out of proportion, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up." Olivia sat down next to him, her face softening with concern. "I get it. This is a lot, Marcus. But you've got to remember, this fight isn't just yours. We're all in this together." Marcus shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "Yeah, but it sure feels like it's all on me. I'm the one who's being targeted. I'm the one they want to shut down." Olivia reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to do this alone. You've got a whole team behind you, and we won't let them take you down." For the first time in weeks, Marcus allowed himself to lean into the support. The weight on his chest felt slightly lighter with Olivia's words, but the fear was still there. The university wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. But what if, in the end, it wasn't enough? What if the system was too big, too powerful? His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. "Come in," Marcus called, his voice hoarse. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped into the room, Dr. Williams. Marcus immediately straightened up, surprised to see his professor at his door so late. "Dr. Williams, what's going on?" "I think it's time we have a serious conversation, Marcus," Dr. Williams said, his tone grave. "The administration is pushing harder than ever to have you expelled. They're framing it as a matter of academic integrity, that your actions are interfering with the educational environment." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Expulsion? Are they serious? Dr. Williams nodded, his expression filled with sympathy. I'm afraid so. They're mobilizing everything they've got against you. They're trying to make an example of you, Marcus. And I don't know how much longer I can protect you from the fallout. A heavy silence settled in the room as the weight of Dr. Williams' words sunk in. Marcus had known this was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Expulsion wasn't just a threat, it was a reality he had to face. What do I do? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. His entire future hung in the balance. Dr. Williams sighed, looking at the ground for a moment before meeting Marcus' eyes. You need to decide whether this fight is still worth it. If you want to continue pushing for change, you'll need to be prepared for the consequences. But know this, you're not alone in this. There are people here who support you, who believe in what you're doing. Marcus swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. The decision was more than just about him now. It was about everyone who had stood behind him, everyone who had believed in the movement. He couldn't back down. Not now. I won't stop, Marcus said, his voice steady. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. And I won't let them silence us. Dr. Williams nodded, his face showing a mix of pride and concern. I'll do everything I can to support you. But you need to understand, this is going to get harder before it gets easier. As the professor left the room, Marcus sat in silence, the weight of his decision sinking in. There was no going back. He had committed to this cause, and now it was time to see it through, no matter what it cost him. The next morning, Marcus was greeted by a slew of emails and text messages, many of which were full of support. But amidst the sea of encouragement, one stood out, a message from the university's dean. Marcus. We are requesting that you attend a meeting with the administration tomorrow morning to discuss your actions and the potential disciplinary measures we may need to take. Failure to attend this meeting could result in immediate suspension. Regards. Dean Richards. The message was a clear ultimatum, and Marcus knew it was coming. They were finally ready to take action against him. The meeting would likely be the final step before they made their move to expel him. He knew he had to go, there was no other option. The fight was no longer just a fight for his own future. It was about everyone who had rallied behind him, everyone who believed in the cause. It was time for him to take the next step, no matter the consequences. As he stood up from his desk and walked out of his room, he felt the familiar fire ignite within him once again. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let them win. He would stand tall. He would stand strong. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Marcus stood before the university's administration building, a sense of dread settling heavily in his stomach. It was still early, and the campus was quieter than usual, almost as if the whole university was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of what would undoubtedly be a pivotal moment in the battle between the students and the administration. He was not alone. Olivia was with him, as well as several other key figures from the protest movement who had shown up to offer their support. Marcus had insisted they not come inside with him, this meeting was his, and he needed to face the administration head-on. But he appreciated the silent show of solidarity. It was clear that the whole student body was behind him, and he couldn't let them down. As he walked up the steps to the building, Marcus felt a pang of uncertainty. This was it. He had been warned that this meeting could decide his fate at the university. The administration had made it clear that they were prepared to take drastic action if necessary. The tension that had been building for weeks seemed to explode in his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside the building, Marcus was escorted through a sterile, gray hallway to a large conference room. The walls were lined with framed degrees and accolades, a stark reminder of the system he was up against. A long wooden table sat in the center, and around it were seated key members of the administration, Dean Richards, a few members of the faculty board, and other high-ranking officials. Their expressions were stern, their eyes focused on him as he entered. "Take a seat, Marcus," Dean Richards said, his tone cold and formal. Marcus nodded and sat down at the opposite end of the table, trying his best to maintain composure despite the overwhelming sense of powerlessness that threatened to rise within him. He wasn't sure if it was the sheer intimidation of the room or the looming consequences of this meeting, but he felt a wave of vulnerability wash over him. "Let's get straight to the point," Dean Richards continued, flipping open a file in front of him. "Your actions have created a disruption on campus. The protests you've organized, the negative media attention, this is no longer just a simple matter of disagreement. It's become a serious concern for the integrity of this institution." Marcus met the dean's gaze, his jaw tightening. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I believe in something that needs to be addressed. Students deserve the right to be heard, and the university needs to be held accountable for how it handles those who challenge it." Dean Richards raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "You think this is about accountability, Marcus? The protests you've instigated have crossed a line. They've disrupted academic activities, caused unrest in the student body, and put the university's reputation at risk. Your actions have consequences." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "What about the consequences for the students who are too afraid to speak up? What about the ones who've been silenced by professors and administrators like you? Are they supposed to just sit back and accept the status quo? Because that's exactly what you want." The room fell silent for a moment. Marcus could feel the weight of the words he had just spoken. He wasn't just speaking to Dean Richards, he was speaking to everyone in the room. The tension was palpable, and the faculty members exchanged uncertain glances. Dean Richards leaned forward, his voice growing more forceful. "We're offering you a chance to resolve this matter without further escalation. You can cease your involvement in the protests, apologize for your actions, and agree to follow the university's guidelines moving forward. If you comply, we'll consider not taking disciplinary action. However, if you choose to continue defying the rules, there will be serious consequences, up to and including expulsion." Marcus's mind raced. This was it. The moment where he had to decide whether to surrender or continue fighting. The offer was tempting. He could go back to his normal life, attend class without the constant threat of retaliation hanging over him. It would be easier to back down, to let the pressure and the fear win. But then he thought of everything he had fought for, the students whose voices had been ignored, the movement that was growing stronger every day. And he knew that backing down wasn't an option. "I can't do that," Marcus said, his voice steady but resolute. "I can't just pretend that everything's okay when it's not. The university needs to change, and if that means I have to take the consequences, then I'll face them." Dean Richards narrowed his eyes, and for a moment, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of respect, whether it was for his conviction or his defiance, he couldn't tell. The dean leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You realize, of course, that this won't end here," Dean Richards said quietly. "If you refuse to comply, there will be no turning back. The university will have no choice but to take decisive action. Your future here is on the line." Marcus met the dean's gaze without flinching. "Then I guess we'll see what happens. I'm not backing down." The room was silent for a long moment. Marcus's words seemed to linger in the air, thick with the weight of their implications. He could see the other administrators exchanging glances, as if they were waiting for someone to speak up. But no one did. The tension had reached a breaking point, and Marcus could feel it vibrating in his bones. Finally, Dean Richards let out a deep breath and stood up. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. But if that's your decision, so be it." With that, he turned to the other administrators. "This meeting is over. We'll let you know the next steps in the coming days." As he walked out of the room, Olivia and the other protesters were waiting for him outside. Their eyes were filled with concern, but when Marcus looked at them, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had come this far together, and they were all in this fight, no matter what. "Are you okay?" Olivia asked, her voice soft. Marcus nodded, though he knew that the hardest part was still ahead. I'm not backing down, Olivia. I can't. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt like he had made the right choice. Whatever the outcome, he had stood up for what he believed in, and that, he knew, was worth fighting for. As the protesters gathered around him, their cheers echoed through the hallways, and Marcus realized that even if he lost everything, he had already gained something far more valuable, a voice, a cause, and a community that would never let him stand alone. The following days after the meeting with the administration were filled with uncertainty, and the weight of Marcus's decision hung heavily in the air. News of his refusal to comply with the university's demands quickly spread across campus. The student body was divided, some were inspired by his determination, while others were concerned about the potential fallout. But there was one thing everyone could agree on: the situation had reached a boiling point, and change was coming, whether the administration liked it or not. Marcus spent most of his time now meeting with student leaders, strategizing the next phase of the movement. Olivia, along with other trusted members of their protest group, worked tirelessly to keep the momentum alive. The tension on campus was palpable, students were more active than ever, rallying for their right to speak out. There was a feeling that something big was on the horizon, but no one knew exactly what it would look like. Despite the chaos outside, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of isolation. He had never been this alone in his life. The administrators, once distant but cordial, now viewed him as an enemy. The students who had once rallied behind him now looked to him for answers, and the pressure to lead was almost suffocating. His inbox overflowed with messages, some of support, but many of doubt and fear. The university was moving forward with the disciplinary process, and Marcus knew his future at the school was hanging by a thread. Late one evening, as Marcus sat alone in his dorm room, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a text from Dr. Williams, the professor who had been one of the few supportive voices among the faculty. Marcus, we need to talk. Meet me in my office first thing tomorrow morning. It's important. Marcus's stomach dropped. He had no idea what this meeting could be about, but given everything that had been happening lately, he feared the worst. He spent the rest of the night lying awake, replaying every conversation and every decision that had led him to this point. Had he made the right choice? Should he have tried to negotiate with the administration instead of digging in his heels? The following morning, Marcus arrived at Dr. Williams' office with a sense of dread. The door opened, and his professor ushered him inside, his expression unusually serious. Marcus, please, sit down, Dr. Williams said, his tone softer than it had been during their previous conversations. Marcus took a seat, his heart racing. What's going on, Dr. Williams? Dr. Williams leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. I need to be honest with you, Marcus. I've been hearing some disturbing things from the administration. They've accelerated their plans to expel you, and they're doing everything they can to make sure you don't have any way out. The pressure is intense, and they're not backing down. Marcus swallowed hard. He had been bracing for this, but hearing the confirmation made it all the more real. So, what does that mean for me? Right now, they're framing it as a violation of university policy. They're claiming that your protests have disrupted the educational environment and created a hostile atmosphere. They've brought up several incidents in which you've been involved with other students who are considered troublemakers. You've become a liability to them, Marcus. The board is meeting in a few days, and it's likely they'll vote on expulsion. Marcus felt his blood run cold. He had known it was a possibility, but hearing it directly from Dr. Williams made him feel like the walls were closing in. Is there anything I can do? Is there any way I can fix this? Dr. Williams exhaled, his face filled with regret. I've tried, Marcus. I've spoken with some of the faculty who are sympathetic to your cause, and I've even tried to appeal to the board. But the pressure is too great. The administration is set on making an example of you, and I fear there's nothing more I can do to change that. For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt utterly defeated. The fight that had once seemed so clear now felt impossible. He had come this far, but the very system he was trying to change seemed bent on crushing him at every turn. What was the point of continuing if the administration had already decided his fate? Dr. Williams stood up and walked over to the window, his back turned to Marcus. "I want you to understand something, Marcus. You've already done something remarkable. You've sparked a movement on this campus. You've made people think, made them question the status quo. Even if they expel you, even if they silence you, your message will live on. And it will inspire others, maybe even more than you can imagine." Marcus felt a flicker of hope stir in his chest, but it was quickly overshadowed by the looming reality of the consequences. "But what does that mean for me? If they expel me, where do I go? What happens next?" Dr. Williams turned around, his face filled with empathy. "I can't answer that. But I want you to know this, you're not alone in this. There are people on campus, students, professors, who will continue this fight, with or without you. What you've started is bigger than you. It's bigger than anyone in this room." Marcus stood up, a fire beginning to reignite in his chest. He had started this fight not for recognition or glory, but for something far greater. It wasn't about him, it was about everyone who had felt voiceless and unheard. And even if they expelled him, even if they tried to erase his presence from the campus, his message would survive. The fight for justice wouldn't stop, not as long as people were willing to stand up for what was right. "Thank you, Dr. Williams," Marcus said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I appreciate everything you've done for me." Dr. Williams nodded. "Whatever happens, Marcus, don't lose sight of the bigger picture. Your story will inspire others. It already has." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. The weight of everything he had learned that day was suffocating. The expulsion was becoming inevitable, but the thought of backing down was unthinkable. He had to stand strong. He had to continue the fight, not just for his own future, but for the students who would come after him. The battle had only just begun. The next day, the protesters gathered again, this time outside the administration building. Their presence was louder, stronger than ever before. As Marcus joined the protesters, his heart swelled with pride. No matter what happened, he had already won something far more valuable than any degree or title. He had ignited a fire, and that fire was spreading. The storm was coming, and Marcus was ready to face it head-on. The university might have thought it could silence him. But it had underestimated the power of a voice that wouldn't be quieted. The protest outside the administration building grew larger by the day. Students, faculty, and even some alumni showed up, holding signs demanding justice for Marcus and the cause he had started. The energy was contagious. People who had never been involved in activism before found themselves swept up in the movement. Marcus could feel the power of their collective resolve with every chant, every cheer, every message of support that came flooding in. Yet, despite the growing support, there was a part of him that couldn't escape the nagging feeling of dread. He knew the university was not backing down. They were relentless, determined to make an example of him. The looming threat of expulsion was growing more real with each passing day, and Marcus could feel the walls closing in. But as the pressure mounted, something unexpected happened. An ally appeared in the most unlikely of places. It started one afternoon when Marcus received an email from an unknown sender. At first, he hesitated to open it, assuming it was just another anonymous threat or a message from someone who didn't agree with his actions. But something about the subject line caught his attention, a different perspective. Marcus opened the email, and the words that followed left him stunned. Marcus. I'm Professor Linda Carson from the Department of Political Science. I've been following the events on campus, and I've been impressed by your leadership and your ability to mobilize students. I know you've been facing tremendous pressure from the administration, and I want to offer my support. I've seen the way the system works from the inside, and I believe I may be able to help you in ways you might not expect. If you're interested, please meet me at my office tomorrow at noon. No one will know. You can trust me. At first, Marcus was unsure. He didn't know Professor Carson personally, and he certainly hadn't heard her name come up in any of the conversations about the protests or the administration's position. But the fact that she had reached out in such a direct and personal way gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was the ally he had been waiting for, someone who could navigate the system and help him. The next day, Marcus walked to Professor Carson's office with a mixture of skepticism and cautious optimism. When he arrived, she was already there, sitting at her desk, flipping through a few papers. She looked up as he entered, offering him a warm, welcoming smile. "Marcus, thank you for coming," she said, motioning for him to sit. "I understand that you're going through an incredibly difficult time right now, and I want you to know that I've been watching how this has unfolded. I've seen the power of your movement, and I believe in what you're doing." Marcus felt a small sense of relief. At least she wasn't here to lecture him or warn him about the consequences of his actions. "Thank you, Professor. I'm glad you reached out. But, honestly, I don't know what you can do to help. The administration is dead set on expelling me, and they've made it clear they won't listen to anyone who speaks up for me." Professor Carson leaned back in her chair and folded her arms thoughtfully. "You're right about that. The administration is determined to maintain control. But I've been part of the faculty here for over a decade, and I know how they operate. They thrive on pressure and silence. But what they don't expect is someone from within their own ranks pushing back." She paused for a moment, as if weighing her next words carefully. "I've been following the legal and procedural aspects of your case. There are certain processes they've overlooked in their rush to expel you. I'm not promising that I can change their minds overnight, but I can help you navigate the bureaucracy and possibly delay their decision long enough for the movement to gain even more traction." Marcus blinked in surprise. "How would you even do that?" Professor Carson smiled. "I know how to move through the system, Marcus. I've seen how they use loopholes to get what they want, and I know where those same loopholes are when they work against them. I can help you challenge their decision, force them to justify their actions publicly. I'm offering you a chance to create enough pressure that they'll have to reconsider." The idea sounded almost too good to be true. Marcus had never imagined that someone from the faculty would be willing to help him in such a direct way. "Why would you do this? I don't even know you." Professor Carson's expression softened. "I've seen how this system operates. It's not about education anymore, it's about control. The administration cares more about its reputation than it does about its students. What you're doing isn't just a protest, it's a challenge to their authority, and I believe in what you're fighting for. I want to see change too, and sometimes, that means working from the inside." "I don't know what to say," Marcus finally muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "This could change everything. If we can hold off their decision long enough, it could give the movement the time it needs to grow, to really make a difference." "That's the idea," Professor Carson said, her eyes meeting his with a sense of resolve. "You've already started something important. I'm just here to help make sure it doesn't end before it's had a chance to do what it was meant to do." Marcus stood up, feeling a sense of determination that he hadn't felt in days. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was bigger than him, it was for every student who had ever felt silenced, for every voice that had been ignored. And now, he had an unexpected ally who could help him navigate the treacherous waters of the system. "Thank you, Professor. I don't know how to repay you, but I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." Professor Carson smiled again, standing up to shake his hand. "No need to repay me. Just keep fighting, Marcus. That's all I ask." As Marcus walked out of her office, he felt a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in weeks, the road ahead didn't seem so impossible. With Professor Carson's help, maybe there was still a chance to turn this all around. The storm was still coming, but now, Marcus wasn't facing it alone. The days following Marcus's meeting with Professor Carson were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. The tension that had clouded his thoughts for weeks started to lift, replaced by the strategy and determination needed to fight back. Marcus knew the road ahead was still perilous, but with Professor Carson's inside knowledge of the system and her willingness to help, they had a fighting chance. They worked quietly but relentlessly, preparing their case against the university's attempt to expel him. Professor Carson meticulously combed through university policies, legal precedents, and student rights, identifying potential vulnerabilities in the administration's case. She knew that the administration had moved quickly and carelessly in their pursuit of Marcus, and that could be their downfall. In the meantime, the protests continued to swell. Word of the administration's aggressive stance toward Marcus had galvanized the student body. More and more students began showing up to the rallies and sit-ins, their numbers swelling with each passing day. It was clear that the fight had reached a new level, one that the administration couldn't ignore. The atmosphere on campus was electric, charged with anticipation. Students were more vocal, more determined than ever before. The protests were no longer just about Marcus, they had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up to a system that prioritized power over people. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student who had ever felt marginalized, every voice that had been silenced. But the administration, desperate to quell the rising tide, was starting to crack down. Security was increased around the protest sites. Students were arrested for protesting on university grounds. The rhetoric from the administration became harsher. President Hawthorne, in particular, was adamant that Marcus needed to be made an example of, to send a message that the university would not tolerate such defiance. Marcus was sitting in his dorm room late one evening, going over the latest protest updates on his laptop, when a notification popped up on his phone. It was a text from Olivia. "Marcus, meet me at the protest site. We need to talk." His heart skipped a beat. The urgency in Olivia's message sent a wave of anxiety through him. He quickly grabbed his jacket and made his way out of the dorm, heading to the quad where the protests were still going strong. As he walked, the campus felt different, he could sense the shift in the air. The tension was thick, like something big was about to happen. When he arrived at the protest site, Olivia was waiting for him near the front lines, her face tense but resolute. "Marcus," she greeted him, pulling him aside. "There's something you need to know. The administration is speeding up the expulsion process. They're going to try to force a decision within the next 48 hours. They've got the board on their side. This is it. It's coming down to the wire." Marcus's stomach twisted in knots. "What can we do? How do we stop them?" Olivia looked at him, her eyes fierce with determination. "We don't stop them, Marcus. We make them stop themselves. You've been in the spotlight for too long now to let them push you around. You've already given them the fight they didn't want, but now you need to go further. You need to make them face the world, make them publicly account for their actions. It's time to force their hand." Marcus took a deep breath, absorbing her words. He knew this was the moment where everything would either fall apart or come together. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. But what could they do to stop an administration that had all the power? Olivia spoke again, her voice unwavering. "We have one last card to play. We go public, really public. We bring in the media." Marcus's eyes widened. "The media? You're suggesting we get the press involved now?" "Exactly," Olivia said, her eyes flashing. "If the university is determined to expel you, we expose everything. We bring the story to the world. If the press gets involved, the administration won't be able to hide behind their usual tactics. They'll be forced to explain themselves to the public. And if they try to expel you after that, they risk losing everything: alumni donations, student enrollment, their reputation. It could ruin them." The idea of going public terrified Marcus. He had seen how quickly the administration had turned against him, and the thought of the university's dirty laundry being aired in front of the media made him uneasy. But he knew Olivia was right. This was the last play they had. Marcus stood there, his mind racing. What if it worked? What if this was the push they needed to finally make the administration back down? "I'll do it," Marcus said, the words feeling like a weight being lifted off his shoulders. "Let's take it to the media." The following morning, Olivia and Marcus met with a small team of student journalists who had been covering the protests. They shared their plan with them, and after some brief hesitation, the group agreed that they had to take the next step. The story would need to be carefully crafted, but it had to make the university look like the bully it had become. Olivia and Marcus spent hours with the journalists, carefully laying out the facts. They documented the administration's actions, the mounting pressure to expel Marcus, and the growing protest movement. They showed how the university had attempted to silence students, how they had tried to push a narrative of rebellion without understanding the real issue. And most importantly, they highlighted the hypocrisy of a university that prided itself on diversity but was willing to sacrifice one of its own students who dared to challenge the status quo. The student journalists worked quickly, their fingers flying across their keyboards as they put together a compelling exposé. By mid-afternoon, the article was ready to go live. With a deep breath, Marcus gave the final approval, and the story was published. Almost instantly, it spread across the internet. Social media was abuzz with outrage, as people from all over the country shared the story. Alumni, current students, faculty members, everyone had an opinion, and it wasn't one that favored the administration. Within hours, the university's social media pages were flooded with comments demanding answers. National news outlets picked up the story. What had begun as a single article exploded into a full-scale media storm. The administration, caught completely off guard, scrambled to contain the damage. They had no idea what hit them. The media storm had taken the university by surprise, but it was clear that Marcus's actions were making waves. The administration, once so confident in their ability to expel him without backlash, was now scrambling to save face. Press conferences were held, and statements were issued in an attempt to justify their actions. But the more they tried to explain themselves, the more it seemed like they were digging a deeper hole. The pressure on President Hawthorne was mounting. Alumni, former professors, and even major donors began speaking out in support of Marcus. One by one, influential figures began to withdraw their support from the university, some even publicly stating that they would no longer donate until the administration reversed their decision. It was clear that the university's carefully crafted reputation was beginning to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny. Still, Marcus knew that none of this would matter if they didn't take the final step. It wasn't just about the media anymore, it was about the board of trustees. The people who held the power to end this fight once and for all. If they didn't act now, the administration would find a way to bury the story and continue with their plans. So, Marcus, Olivia, and Professor Carson sat down late one evening to devise their next move. It was time to make the ultimate push. "We need to get to the board," Marcus said, his voice firm. "I know they're meeting in a few days. We need to make sure they hear our side of the story before they make their decision." Olivia nodded. "The administration will try to spin it, try to make you look like the villain. But we can't let that happen. We need to show them who's really behind this." Professor Carson, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up. "We need more than just a statement. We need witnesses, people who were there. Students, faculty, even staff. They need to see the full picture." Marcus turned to her. "You're suggesting we bring them to the board meeting?" Professor Carson's gaze was steady. "Exactly. We don't just speak to them. We show them. If we can get a few key individuals, people who have been part of the protests, people who understand what this is really about, then we'll have a real shot at swaying the board's opinion. They can't ignore first-hand testimony. Not when it comes from their own colleagues." Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it, the final battle. They were going to fight back with everything they had, and it was going to be messy. But Marcus was done being passive. He had spent too long letting the administration call the shots. Now, it was his turn to take control. In the days leading up to the board meeting, Marcus worked closely with Olivia, Professor Carson, and the student journalists who had been covering the protests. They carefully selected a group of people who would attend the meeting and speak on their behalf. They needed students who had attended the protests, professors who had supported them, and alumni who understood the deeper implications of what was happening on campus. The team was small but mighty, each person had a personal story to tell, and each story would make the case stronger. They would be presenting not just facts, but raw, emotional truths that the board couldn't ignore. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the group assembled in the hallway outside the meeting room. The tension was palpable. Marcus could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every student who had ever felt oppressed, every person who had been silenced in the name of power and control. Olivia turned to him, her face serious. "You've come this far, Marcus. You've shown them that you won't back down. We're with you, all the way." Marcus nodded. "I know. But this isn't just my fight anymore. It's all of ours." Professor Carson gave him a reassuring smile. "We've done everything we can. Now, we just have to trust that the truth will speak for itself." As they entered the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The members of the board sat at a long table, their faces unreadable. President Hawthorne was there as well, his expression one of stern determination. The room fell silent as the group of students, faculty, and alumni took their seats. The first to speak was Marcus himself. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest, but his voice steady. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I know that the decision to expel me has already been made by some of you, but I ask that you hear me out before you make your final judgment." He glanced around the room, making eye contact with each of the board members, including President Hawthorne. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because I believe in the principles this university was founded on. But what I've seen in the past few weeks is the exact opposite of what this institution stands for. We're supposed to be a place of open dialogue, of progress, of learning. But instead, we've been told to stay silent, to sit down, and to accept things as they are." Marcus paused, letting his words sink in. "But we can't accept things as they are. Not when it means silencing people like me, people who want to make this university a better place for everyone." The room was still, and for a moment, it seemed as though the weight of his words was hanging in the air. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "I don't want to be expelled. I don't want to be a symbol of rebellion. But I will not stand idly by while this institution disregards its own values. If you choose to expel me, you're not just expelling me, you're expelling every student who believes in the power of their voice. And that's not something you can take away from us." He sat down, his heart racing. He had said what needed to be said, but he knew this was just the beginning. Olivia was next. She stood and addressed the board, her voice clear and unwavering. "I've been part of the protests since the beginning, and I've seen what this movement means to the students here. It's not about Marcus. It's about the freedom to speak up, to challenge the status quo. If you expel him, you'll be sending a message to every student here that their voices don't matter. That their opinions don't matter. Is that the message you want to send?" One by one, the others spoke, sharing their stories, their experiences, and their belief in what Marcus was fighting for. The board members listened, their faces hardening with each passing testimony. When the last person finished speaking, the room was thick with tension. The board remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Finally, President Hawthorne stood, his voice measured but firm. "Thank you for your testimony. We will take all of this into consideration. We'll make our decision soon." Marcus's heart was pounding. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like they had a real shot at winning. As he left the boardroom with Olivia and Professor Carson, the tension was still heavy in the air. But there was also a sense of pride. They had done everything they could. They had fought with everything they had. Now, it was up to the board. The days following the showdown in the boardroom were tense and uncertain. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that everything was hanging in the balance. The media attention hadn't slowed down, and neither had the protests. In fact, both seemed to have gained momentum after the board meeting. News outlets continued to cover the story, and the university was being scrutinized like never before. But the waiting game was excruciating. Marcus found it difficult to focus on anything else. Every time his phone buzzed, he immediately checked it, only to find another message of support, or sometimes, a harsh comment from someone who didn't understand his fight. Olivia was busy organizing more protests, while Professor Carson was reviewing every bit of legal strategy she could find, just in case the board's decision came down to a legal battle. The final decision had been set for the end of the week. Marcus spent those days watching the clock, each passing hour making him feel more and more like he was trapped in a holding pattern. There was nothing more they could do but wait and hope. It was late Friday afternoon when Marcus received the call. His phone rang, and without thinking, he grabbed it, his hands shaking. The number was from the university. His heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" he answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, this is Dean Richardson. I'm calling to inform you that the Board of Trustees has made their decision regarding your expulsion." His stomach twisted into a knot. What did they decide? There was a long pause before Dean Richardson spoke again. "After reviewing all the testimonies and the media coverage surrounding your case, the board has decided not to expel you." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Wait, what? You heard me correctly. The board has chosen to reverse their decision to expel you. Instead, they have decided to put you on probation for the remainder of the semester. Additionally, you will be required to attend a series of community-building workshops to ensure that this situation doesn't escalate further." Marcus felt like he had been hit by a wave of emotion. Relief washed over him, followed by disbelief, then joy. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, Marcus. The board has recognized the importance of free speech and student activism. They've decided that your actions, while disruptive, have sparked a necessary conversation on campus. But they're also making it clear that there are consequences for defying university policies. This probation is an opportunity for you to reflect on the situation and take the necessary steps to rebuild trust with the administration." "Thank you," Marcus managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you so much. I'm sure you'll do well moving forward," Dean Richardson replied before the call ended. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his heart still racing. He had won. They had won. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Olivia, who had been on edge waiting for news, was the first person Marcus called. He could barely get the words out before she shouted with excitement, her voice breaking with relief. "Oh my God, Marcus! You did it! You actually did it! This is incredible!" Marcus laughed, still in a state of shock. "I know. I can't believe it. They didn't expel me. They're giving me a second chance." Olivia let out a triumphant cheer. "This is huge. Not just for you, but for everyone. You've shown them that we're not just going to sit down and let them walk all over us." Professor Carson called later that evening, her voice warm and full of pride. "Marcus, I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. You fought for what's right, and you've made a real impact. This victory is as much yours as it is the university's, for showing that we can have difficult conversations and come out stronger." It was a victory, but Marcus knew that this wasn't the end of the fight. He still had to go through the probationary period and attend the required workshops. And although the university had backed down on expelling him, he was still fully aware that the administration wasn't going to just let things go. They would watch him closely, perhaps even with a certain degree of hostility. But for the first time in weeks, Marcus didn't feel like he was alone in this. The campus, too, had been forever changed. The protests hadn't stopped, but they had shifted in tone. Now, they weren't just about Marcus. They were about the broader issues he had raised: student rights, free speech, and the need for the administration to be held accountable. And while Marcus had been the face of this movement, he was quick to acknowledge that he couldn't have done it without the help of Olivia, Professor Carson, and the countless students who had stood beside him. It was a few days later when Marcus received a surprise invitation. A student group that had been a key part of the protests wanted to meet with him. They were planning a community-building event in collaboration with the university administration, and they wanted him to speak at it. At first, Marcus was hesitant. He knew he had his own feelings about the administration and their response to the protests, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face them directly. But as he thought about it more, he realized this could be another chance to change things from within, to continue pushing for progress, and to show that the conversation wasn't over. The event took place in the university's large auditorium, with a panel of students, faculty, and administrators present. Marcus was introduced as the keynote speaker, and as he walked to the podium, he felt a strange mixture of emotions: nervousness, excitement, and, above all, determination. He stood before a crowd of students and professors who had been a part of the protests, as well as members of the administration who had once been determined to expel him. The room was filled with a palpable tension, but Marcus knew that this moment could be a turning point. He was no longer just a student being punished. He was a voice for change. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice strong. "A few weeks ago, I stood before you as a student at risk of being expelled. I was told I was too disruptive, too vocal, that my protests were causing too much trouble. But today, I stand here with all of you because I believe that our voices matter, even when they shake the foundation of the systems we're a part of." He paused, making eye contact with the room. "This isn't over. The fight for free speech, for equality, for justice, it's ongoing. We've made progress, but we can't stop now. We have to keep pushing. We have to make sure that this university lives up to its values, and that includes standing up for every student, regardless of their race, background, or beliefs." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Then, Marcus smiled. "I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm here because I believe that we can all make a difference, together. We've shown the administration that we're not going anywhere. And we're not just fighting for me, we're fighting for everyone who feels like they don't have a voice." As he finished, the room erupted into applause. But Marcus knew that the fight was far from over. This victory, while important, was just one step in a much larger journey. The days after the community-building event had a surreal quality to them. Marcus was no longer just a student caught in a whirlwind of controversy. He was now an active force for change on campus, and the future seemed brighter than ever. It wasn't that the struggle was over, far from it. But the university had taken a step back, and with that, a door had opened for dialogue, for growth, and most importantly, for progress. Marcus spent the next few weeks participating in the community workshops, which, despite his initial skepticism, turned out to be far more constructive than he had anticipated. The sessions were meant to help students, faculty, and staff engage in difficult conversations about race, identity, and the complexities of free speech on campus. At first, Marcus felt uneasy. How could this truly address the systemic issues the university had been perpetuating? But as the weeks went by, he realized that the workshops weren't just about resolving conflict, they were about fostering understanding, building empathy, and creating space for open dialogue. They were not a quick fix, but they were a necessary start. During one of the sessions, Marcus had a breakthrough moment. The group was discussing the very events that had led to his expulsion, and he shared his perspective for the first time without any filter. He spoke not only of the anger and frustration that had driven him to protest but also of the fear that his voice, his presence, would never matter in a space dominated by people who didn't understand him. As he spoke, the room grew quiet. People were listening, really listening. And for the first time, Marcus felt like he was truly being heard. That moment was transformative. It wasn't just about his personal victory anymore, it was about the collective power of people coming together to address uncomfortable truths. Olivia and Professor Carson, who had been beside him every step of the way, were proud of the changes happening on campus. The protests had evolved into something deeper, more meaningful. Students were no longer just rallying against an unjust system, they were working with the administration to bring about lasting change. But Marcus knew the fight for true equality and justice would never be completely over. "I know this isn't the end," Marcus told Olivia one evening as they sat together on the steps of the campus library, watching the sun set. "There's still so much to be done." Olivia smiled. "Of course, but look at what we've already accomplished. They tried to silence you, and now, they're listening. They're learning. And we're learning too," Marcus added. "I've been so focused on what I was fighting against that I didn't realize how important it was to listen to others, even when they disagree with me. It's not just about winning, it's about growing together." Professor Carson, who had been a mentor throughout this journey, joined them a moment later. "You've all done something incredible. This wasn't just about one person, it was about starting a conversation that needed to happen. Now it's up to you to keep pushing, to keep learning, and to keep speaking up when it matters." They were right. This wasn't the end. But it was a new beginning, one that held the promise of change, not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had been part of the movement. As the semester drew to a close, Marcus stood in front of the crowd during the final community forum. This time, there was no tension, no fear. Just the quiet, steady belief that they had come a long way together. The university was no longer the same place it had been months ago, and neither was he. "I stand here today as a different person than the one who first walked into this campus," Marcus said, his voice clear and strong. "I came to this school wanting to learn, wanting to grow. And I've learned a lot, about myself, about this institution, and about the world. But most importantly, I've learned that we all have a role to play in making this world better. It's easy to feel small, to think that one person can't make a difference. But I'm here to tell you that every voice matters. Every action matters. And together, we can make real change." The room erupted in applause, but Marcus didn't just feel pride in his words. He felt something deeper, something that was more meaningful than any applause, a sense of fulfillment, of purpose. He had become part of something larger than himself. And in that moment, Marcus realized that the fight he had started wasn't just about his own freedom or his own voice. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, who had ever felt invisible, or who had ever been told their opinions didn't matter. It was about building a future where people weren't afraid to speak out, to challenge the status quo, and to demand a better world for all. As Marcus walked off the stage, he felt a quiet sense of peace. He had won, yes. But more than that, he had created something bigger than a single victory. He had sparked a movement, one that would continue long after he graduated, long after he left the campus behind. And that was the true victory. Marcus didn't know what the future held. But as he walked across the campus that had once felt like an enemy, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. Because no matter how difficult the path ahead would be, he was no longer walking it alone. The people who had stood by him, the ones who had fought beside him, were now part of a community that could never be silenced. They had started something that would live on long after they had moved on. In the end, Marcus had discovered the most important lesson of all: the power of one voice, when it speaks for justice, can change everything. And that voice would never be silenced again. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?